Anyone who watches some of these videos may have gotten the correct impression that I'm interested in medieval history. I just said so on my last video, actually. And especially interested in medieval religious life and sort of religious thought, mysticism, doctrine, all of that good stuff. This is one of those books for people who are interested in things like that. It's called The Great Medieval Heretics, 5 Centuries of Religious Dissent by Michael Frassetto. And it's a pretty thin book for being full of 5 centuries worth of stuff. Maybe 200 pages or so. But let me just read what he does is he goes by chapters. And each chapter has an idea or a person or set of people that he talks about. So the chapters are arranged topically and just sort of go over what he's talking about, and if anything in here interests you, you can watch the video, and if not, please skip it. So some of the people and ideas. Pope Bogomil and Cosmos the Presbyter from the 10th century. Stephen and Lissos, the heretics of the 11th century. Henry the Monk and the early 12th century. Valdez of Lyons and the Waldensians. Raymond VI of Toulouse and his crusade against the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade. Pierre Auter, who is known as the last Cathar. Fra Dolcino and the Espolistici. Marguerite Porete, John Wycliffe and the Lollards. Jan Hus and heresy in Bohemia. And at the end he has a conclusion and a summation. But those are some of the big ideas and the big people. If you're interested in this, you'll probably recognize several of those names. More than at any other time, the average person of the European Middle Ages found their identity bound up in religious and moral norms. And in this book, Frassetto discusses what can happen when some thinkers push the boundaries of traditional religious understanding and were, as the title leads you to believe, eventually branded as heretics. What's particularly special about this text is that the author doesn't present the heresies compartmentalized from their social context. Rather, he sort of integrates appropriate aspects of cultural and political environments so that the reader can fully understand how they come about and the purposes that they serve. And inevitably, in most cases, the demise of the heretics in question. The modern mind ties the word heretic to a sort of radical libertinism that flirts with godlessness and amorality. As Frassetto explores the varieties of heresies within the church, we find out that most of these vanguards attacked the church, and I say Catholic Church here since all the heresies explored in here are very much pre-Reformation, though one could argue that they did have influences on Luther and Calvin. Attacks the church sort of from... I hesitate to use this language because it is a little bit misleading, but they don't attack the church from the left, they attack it from the right. And they claim that the church was too materialistic, that it was too worldly, that it had lost touch with God and his ways. In a word, many of these heresies were conservative in nature because they sort of got back to the radical root. I mean, that's what radical means, right? It means getting back to the roots of the gospel, the roots of the Bible, the roots of Christianity. They wanted to conserve an older worldview of godly purity, of apostolic holiness, and in many cases vows of extreme poverty. The only challenge these thinkers wanted to impose was to erase the all-too-worldly influences that the church had grown complacent in and complacent with. So, who are these fascinating people that he talks about? Like I mentioned earlier, each chapter tells the story of one or two heretics and discusses a movement that they were closely tied to. Like I said, some of the names are Bogomil, Stephen, and Lissos, who were leaders of a sect at Orleans, Henry the Monk, Peter Waldo, who was closely associated with the Waldensians, Raymond VI of Toulouse, Fraldosino, Marguerite Porret, John Wycliffe, Jan Hus. Just a little bit about some of these folks. Henry the Monk of Lucerne, who flourished in the early 12th century from around 1110 to around 1148 when he was thrown in prison. Hardly a heretic by today's standards, he preached a return to apostolic poverty and saintliness and orthodoxy, and spoke out against the church's worldliness. And while the life of Peter Waldo, about a generation later, he lived from around 1140 to 1218, very much resemble the lives of other now canonized saints, his emphasis on self-imposed poverty and the importance of lay preaching, that is, preaching by people who are not themselves members of the church, not priests, not bishops, but just average, everyday people. Those things rendered him a danger, in the opinion of the Third Lateran Council. The stories of John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, whose names are probably more recognizable than Henry the Monk and Peter Waldo, portend the later religious wars of the 16th and the 17th centuries. Because each chapter tells this sort of self-contained story of a movement over a relatively short period of time, the book makes for really interesting reading, and if you don't want to sit down and read it cover to cover, it's certainly a fascinating, handy reference book for all of these topics. As well as, interesting for anyone who wants to gain just a rudimentary understanding of heterodox religious opinions on the periphery of the church from around the year 950 to 1000 to around 1400 or 1500. This comes especially recommended for those who are interested in historical developments of the Catholic Church and anyone interested in medieval history. As should be deduced from the size of the book, it is relatively slim. This isn't a scholarly text. It is one written for perhaps the lay, generally educated audience, but it is one that introduces material on sort of the beginner to intermediate level and has a lot of monographs that are listed and a really great bibliography that's in the back. So if any of this interests you, this is not a bad place to start. The Great Medieval Heretics, 5 Centuries of Religious Dissent by Michael Frassetto.